Hi there, it's Ian here, and you're watching Grumpy Opinions, the show where I'm going to tell you all about what I think of films, TV shows, games, and life in general. Let's get on with the show.
WandaVision is the MCU Disney Plus TV show, which is frankly just getting bonkers and more crazy by the moment. Episode 5, on a very special episode, picks up with Wanda and Vision slap bang in the middle of the 80s, and they're struggling with two loud and crying little babies who are immune to Wanda's magic attempts to get them to have a quiet sleep. Luckily, Agnes turns up and she's all like, I can help, only she ends up fluffing a line and then things get a bit odd, which perks up Vision's notice and his concern. But just then, the twins magic into a pair of 10-year-olds, and drunky Agnes is like, it's fine, who cares, because clearly she just doesn't actually even care anymore. And the twins end up getting themselves a sneaky wee dog, but Mum and Dad aren't sure this is a good idea, especially Vision, who's a bit more concerned by the predictable appearance of Agnes right at that exact moment, and Wanda barely even trying to hide her powers at this point. And then the boys age up to 12ish, and the entire dog argument just gets forgotten.
Meanwhile,
outside Westview, Monica's woken up, and she's been through her tests and her blood samples, but they came back all weird, although she's keen to get back to work, and Chairman GMan's laying out the land. And he tells Jimmy off for being a bit too even-handed with his Wanda history. Then Monica starts arguing with him about how Wanda isn't actually bad or something. And then he ends up showing footage of Wanda breaking into S.W.O.R.D headquarters to steal Vision's corpse. So they get to work on how they can get back inside the Hex, which is what they're calling it now. And they realise that the clothes that Monica was wearing when she got soaked in got transformed.
Those pants are 87% Kevlar.
And that means that anything that's actually from the 1980s will stay exactly the same without being transformed. So theoretically, when it enters it, it'll be fine. And meanwhile, Vision's having a bad day at work because the new computers allow him to access an email system, and he manages to see a message meant for the agents in the S.W.O.R.D base, and that makes him realise that this is all really just an illusion. And he ends up zapping his colleague Norm's head, and the guy starts begging to see his family and starts talking about the pain that he's in constantly. So Vision puts him back the way he was, to sitcom normal. Meanwhile, Wanda and the kids hear a strange noise outside, and that ends up spooking the dog, and it turns out that it's actually a drone from the 1980s. Yeah, those existed apparently. And Monica tries to contact Wanda with it, but when Wanda comes outside the house and they get her in the sights, the G-Man tells her,
take the shot.
And Wanda understandably is a wee bit cross and ends up dragging the drone back outside of the Hex and tells them all to absolutely leave her alone or bad things will happen, and warns that if they don't, there's going to be trouble. And Monica ends up spouting a lot of waffle about her being a friend, and since Wanda being a telepath, she must know that. And Wanda goes, yeah, well, still stay away. And then she psychics the soldiers to point the guns at the G-Man and goes back inside, making the walls of the Hex go all red and wibbly and bad. And back inside, Wanda and the kids start looking for the dog, and Agnes ends up bringing it out, saying that it ate some bad leaves and died. And the kids are like, well, that's fine, you can make it alive again, can't you, Mum? And Wanda's like, no, I can't do that. And even Agnes is like,
You can do that?
and the kids beg even more, and then Vision arrives, and he's sad as well. And that night, Wanda and Viz are tidying up after burying the dog in the back garden, and Vision tells her that he spoke to Norm, and he knows about how the whole place is fake and everything's wrong and weird, and that she can't just magic him into not caring about it. And she's all like, sure can, but he's not having it, and breaks the credit roll, and then gets properly angry, and it actually looks like it's going to kick off between both of them. And then she tries to calm him down, talking about how he's the father of her kids and he's her husband, and Vision ends up realising that something's still not right. And she protests that she's not controlling things, and right then, a knock comes at the door. And it's not Agnes, it's her brother, Quicksilver. Only he's been recast with a strangely familiar but slightly different face. And he's just like,
Who's a popsicle?
and Vision just looks disappointed. But what does it all mean? So what did I think? I mean, I hope you don't have anything on the stove or you haven't got a bath running, because this could be a really long one. But basically, you know how last week's episode was all about laying the groundwork for the team of S.W.O.R.D operatives, explaining what the Hex was and who Geraldine is outside of this glamour? Well, this week we're into a two-pronged story following both sets of these characters, both inside and outside the sitcom. So, I mean, let's get the smaller things out of the way first. I thought it was really interesting how there's now divisions in the S.W.O.R.D treatment of this scenario, because you had the acting director G-Man guy leading heavily into the she's a terrorist angle, talking about Wanda, and prepping for bear with missile drones and essentially taking proper precautions against it, assuming that she's a big bad. But then at the other side, we've got Monica, who's got a much more sympathetic and fluffy way of looking at it, a bit like Darcy and Agent Woo, who both are also massively fanboying over all this, or fangirling, bit of both. Fan-childing? Anyway, it was also really cute how Darcy was so invested in the sitcom that she basically turned into a little fangirl as soon as she met Monica.
Well, I'm a big fan.
That was actually a line that I got a bit confused about, but I thought she just meant she was a fan in general, and then it clicked that she was talking about the sitcom, because otherwise, why would Darcy know who Monica is? She's a secret agent. But also, I liked some of the things that they worked out, like the idea of the clothes being Kevlar because she'd been wearing a tack vest that was made of Kevlar. And 80s things would still work if they went in there because they wouldn't be altered by the change. But the meat of this episode was really like how they've turned it into an 80s sitcom. And wow, they really did a number this week. I mean, it looks and sounds absolutely perfect. I mean, even the plot line, the horrible clothes and the terrible jokes were absolutely accurate to the era. And I'm really glad that they opted to have the comedy of this episode take a bit of a back seat, because to be honest, I'm not really a fan of 80s sitcoms, and there are some really cheesy 80s sitcom jokes in this episode and some of the visual gags and things. And I'm really glad that, again, they emphasised it not to show the jokes as if this was a sitcom, but to show that the jokes are there. But the audience's focus is on the fact that the Vision's ever-growing realisation that something's very wrong here. And I liked how all the actors played this, especially how Agnes is literally just breaking character now. Like they're on the set of a sitcom. Like her whole thing.
Do you want me to take that again?
That's really interesting, and it's curious because her breaks in character, because like the one last week with the herb by the wall, and, you know, the Monica bit where she suddenly starts talking about Ultron, that kind of feels a bit like Wanda might be losing her grip on the whole thing, that she's not capable of actually holding it all together, and possibly people are slipping out of her control. But either that because she's becoming unhinged, or because something else is going on that we don't know about yet. And we're only 5 episodes into a 9-part series, so I'd guess that it's the latter option, that something else is going on, since by rights, most stories like this will be a 3-part structure, so 9 episodes, 3-part structure. By rights, next week will be the end of Act 2. And so I would expect there'll be a big twist or some big revelation going to come next week. And that'll probably change the way we actually view the whole situation. Now, a quick point here. It's been pretty impossible to avoid some of the chatter online about this. And there has been a lot of theorising online that Agnes might actually be the baddie on this show, since, as I said in episode 1, she's a kind of oddly specific choice of actor for just a minor role. And I'm not sure really, because I'm unconvinced completely, because her actions do also fit with her just being somebody dragged into the hex against her will. But there is apparently a side point that when you saw the board of people going up and getting named, all the actors, who are the real people who are playing the actors in the sitcom, her photo doesn't actually have a driver's license attached. Now that's interesting, and I never noticed that, but a friend of mine pointed that out to me when we were talking about it. So yeah, anyway, because it's strange because she is such a prevalent person in the sitcom. It was also interesting this week was so much about Wanda grappling with her own grief. And also, side note, how awesome was it that when she got super angry, when she popped back out from the Hex to throw the drone at them, she's literally back to using her Sokovian accent.
This will be your only warning. You don't bother me, I won't bother you.
The accent she had in the very, very first couple of times we saw her, like in Age of Ultron and Marvel Civil War. But as I was saying, grief was the theme of the episode, since it was all about how the kids got the dog and the dog died, and Wanda learning the lesson you can't just bring stuff from the dead without consequence, which is kind of fitting because, of course, we know that she brought Vision back from the dead, and it all ties into this bonkers ending with her dead brother. And I imagine some of that went right over the heads of a few casual movie fans and such, but there is something quite important about how this whole bit about them recasting Piotr at the end. As I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, Piotr, aka Quicksilver in the MCU, was played by Aaron Taylor-Johnson, and interestingly, or possibly contractually, he didn't appear in this at all. Not even in the briefing where, they had shots of Wanda, you would expect there to be like a photo of him appear somewhere in that screen. It could be that using his face means they have to pay him or something like that, or maybe he's too busy being a serious actor, because he has done a load of films like Outlaw King and Tenet and stuff like that. Or it could be that they're going to sneak him in later on, it'll be another big surprise. But the guy who actually turns up was an actor called Evan Peters, and the reason that this is interesting is because in the X-Men movie series, they also use the character Quicksilver, because technically the X-Men comics are part of the Marvel Universe. It's just that they actually were owned by a different company. It's Fox that owned them, not Disney. So the thing is, in the X-Men movies, the recent ones, Evan Peters actually played Quicksilver, the same character, but in that he was called Peter, not Piotr. And sure enough, okay, this is a funny little gag. And yeah, the practice of changing actors in sitcoms, I mean, that's nothing new. I mean, God, they did that on Roseanne, with Becky, or they did that with Darren on I Dream of Jeannie. But the reason it's important here is because it's the first inclusion of anything from the X-Men universe in a Marvel property since Disney bought Fox Studios for $71 billion. because they technically now own the X-Men franchise and they can put anything from it into the Marvel Universe now. And why is that important? Because it leaves the door open for two things that could happen. First off, the MCU could legitimately have people like Deadpool, Wolverine, Jean Grey, or whatever turn up in a movie. But what also is more likely is they're going to do a multiverse crossover. Like back in about 2019, where all the CW shows did like a spin on the Flashpoint stories, where it allowed them to bring multiple actors who'd done different versions of the characters in films or TV shows over the years and put them all in the same storyline. So, as a side note, apparently this is actually going to be a big thing coming up. I mean, the next Doctor Strange movie is literally called The Multiverse of Madness. And also, you might have seen there was an animated Spider-Man movie that kind of did the same thing. And apparently the next live-action Spider-Man movie is also going to do this. And they've already confirmed that the two previous Spider-Mans are actually going to definitely turn up in that, as well as Tom Holland, who plays it currently in the MCU. So yeah, this is something major to put a pin in going forwards, even just to see how this show deals with Piotr, or indeed Peter, as he's called. And of course, the other big side of this is Vision, or the Vision. Now, he's been twigging that something isn't right since episode 1, and in episode 3, Wanda specifically managed to sort of magic him into having a different mindset with a jump cut. But this week, we've hit the point where he literally can't ignore it anymore, and on top of that, he's starting to mistrust Wanda and the world around him, especially when he realises the stuff about Norm and the email. And I really like how Paul Bettany's playing this, really leaning into the sitcom style, but also having a bit of a real-world drama feel to it.
I spoke with Norm.
Oh?
I unearthed the man's suppressed personality and I spoke to him free of your oversight.
I mean, he's taking in the crazy situation, but the outburst at the end, that's not only out of character, it almost feels like he's mimicking Wanda, and it could be because if he's created by her, maybe it's her memory of him, so it's imbued with her personality. And yet also, this wee moment, I really liked it, because I actually bought the pair as a couple. You can see that they actually care. I mean, actors appearing like a real-life couple, it's good acting. And it's the closest we've seen of anything like this since Endgame when they were on holiday in Edinburgh. Now, honestly, just so much good stuff this week. But I'm also kind of afraid that for every good step this show's taking in a positive direction, it's taking at least one, if not two, back in a different area. Now, I spent an awful lot of time last episode pointing out how the S.W.O.R.D facility scenes with Jimmy and Darcy were kind of set up, and they were info dumps for people who watch the MCU, or people who don't, who just wanted to understand how this all fits together in some sort of way. Now, this week was kind of half-heartedly double downing on that, dropping absolutely loads of facts on us and at the same time not really explaining things properly, just doing another week of event horizoning, as I said last week, with lots of scenes of people saying, hey, here's a fact, trust me, it's just true, just move on with the story, don't worry about it, don't worry about how I came by that information.
Wanda's twins are hers. Everything might look fake in the TV, but everything in there is real.
Wanda's not a terrorist.
She could have taken out Thanos on her own if he hadn't initiated a blitz.
And I survived because she chose to protect me.
And this literally started from the first scene we saw of them. I mean, remember last week how I grumped about how it seemed a bit strange that Monica just to state outright as soon as she came out of the hex saying,
It's Wanda. It's all Wanda.
And how I said I was really worried that they might not explain it properly. Well, for 30 seconds of this episode, I actually thought that was completely wrong, and because she starts talking about what she felt inside the hex, how she was under Wanda's spell, and I thought, great, we're going to actually hear about that. But then Flimin, Abbott and Costello wander in and interrupt her and say that there's a big meeting on, so okay, cool, they'll get back to this later. P.S. They totally don't get back to it later. What's more, the nurse is like, well, we need to redo all your tests and blood work, this isn't right. But Monica's like, and ain't nobody got time for that. Okay, put a pin in that, because we'll get back to that. After that, we're into this big tactical briefing where they mention that Monica's intel's given them loads of stuff to work with. And I was like, oh, cool, okay, we're going to hear some about it. Nope, they never tell us anything more about it. We just get this ham-fisted scene of Agent Wu. Remember, Agent Wu of the FBI, Jimmy is an FBI agent, talking to Director Hirschman of S.W.O.R.D, which is basically Space CIA. And Jimmy's getting uppity because the acting director mentioned that Wanda and Piotr were radicalized into Hydra, which is true. Now, fair play to the show, at least, the director does give him this look, which pretty much says everything. And then 2 minutes later, when the GMan mentions like Lagos and Sokovia, and basically says, look, she's effectively a terrorist, which is probably a bit harsh, but then Jimmy has a wee mini rant, which is so out of place in that situation that it just makes him sound like an unprofessional idiot. I mean, you wouldn't be saying that to the head of the CIA. And this is where I start to really worry, especially after like this wee joke here.
I try not to speak ill of people.
Then allow me. Hayward's a dude.
Terrorists.
And then Monica's suddenly like, but Wanda isn't bad. I was almost screaming at the TV. Why? Tell us why then. And then we get like this bit of footage about like her stealing stuff. Now, anyway, put a pin in that because this is going to be important like, later. But first, let me finish up talking about why all this bugs me. Now, clearly Monica is the hero of this show. We're supposed to like her, we're supposed to support her choices, and we want to see her succeed. And when someone's writing a hero, there's a really big temptation to make sure that the hero comes across well by making them right all the time. Similarly, there's a temptation to show how good or bad the hero is by contrasting them with someone else. So this is like day one writing lesson sort of show don't tell stuff. Now, what do we actually know about Monica other than what we know about her from Captain Marvel when she was about 10? Nothing. All we know is that she loved her mum, she was a S.W.O.R.D agent, she did space missions, she's a bit of a chip off the old block, and she's desperate to get back to work despite being blipped and being dusted for 5 years after the snap. And how do we know all this? Because we were told it in episode 4. But then she goes out and gets sucked into the Hex, spends a while there and gets spat out. And in that episode, what we were shown was that her being frantic but capable in an understandable situation, so far so good. And then she was like likeable and reasonable with her new boss, so far so good. And then she stuck her hand into a force field. Twice. So okay, maybe a decent agent or a pilot or something, but clearly not that bright. Now this week we have her flatly telling the audience that she knows more than everybody else about everything, about the situation, but then it shows us that she's somebody who just disobeys orders, spouts things without actually knowing what she's saying, believes Wanda, like a mind-controlling person, over her boss, and worse of all, she's happy to like grab somebody else's gun and start shooting at a pinboard in a makeshift building in the middle of a facility that was thrown together to basically examine something. So a place that probably has paper-thin walls, and she's literally firing a gun at a pair of trousers. Now, okay, maybe she just isn't health and safety conscious, but this is a show showing us that she's not a very clever person. She's not a clever, nice agent. She's a rule-breaking, pig-headed idiot who's swayed by a sob story and possibly mind control. Now, all of this is fine if the show turns out later on that there is some kind of mind control or something else going on that affects her, but I don't think that's the case, because see, the other side of this is, if you look at what they've done with the GMan character, they've done the complete opposite. Now, last week I did mention that he's probably going to turn out to die or turn out to be a bad guy, and on the basis of this episode, I'm now completely confident to say that it's definitely the latter. He's going to turn out to be a bad guy, although he might still die. And it's because this is a terribly written show, full of cliches. Now, I did mention that middle-aged or old white guy bosses in the MCU usually mean bad guys. I mean, or at the very least, they mean old establishment idiot who is always wrong. And not only that, considering the show made a really big point of mentioning how he's acting director, and he only got the job because basically there wasn't really anybody else around, which obviously lessens him in the audience's eyes, even if they didn't notice, your brain did. But our natural thought is, okay, clearly Monica would be better on that job because her mum used to do it. And these are all really cheap writer's tricks right here, so I mean, if you know anything about screenwriting, you'll spot these a mile away. But that was before we ever saw him do or say anything. Now get this.
What am I looking at? You. What is this? Where's this coming from?
It isn't bad, but it's dismissive, even though it's accurate. And in emergency, people don't actually generally ask names of things, like people in the government and high-end agencies. Saying things like you or that man or that woman when talking to people, that's pretty standard terminology for emergency situations. And in the context of this show, it actually does make sense. But being that it's aimed at Darcy, that's going to rub some people up the wrong way. They're going to be like, he doesn't even ask what her name is. And then this week, all of that falls into place. I mean, his argument with Jimmy, the insistence of the narrative on Wanda being a radicalised terrorist, the fact that he armed the drone in order to be fired basically at children and nobody told Monica, these are all bad guy points. These are points that allow the show to throw together this idea that we've now got a little good guy cabal of loose agent Monica, fun non-threatening uncle type Jimmy Woo, and snarky super bright millennial hacker Darcy. And why would you need a little cabal of 3 little good happy heroes? You know, when you've got a whole base full of agents that are supposedly on the good guy side, why do you need this little cell of special good guys? Because clearly it's going to turn out that director GMan is a bad guy. I mean, he might not be Hydra, but he's been up to bad things. How do I know this? Because they've already given us all the clues that tells us this. Point together really obviously because the writing is so over-constructed to do this that it can't really be anything else. I mean, look at this. Wanda breaks into S.W.O.R.D to get Vision's corpse. Why would she do that? Not only that, why did they then specifically mention that he didn't want to be made into a weapon? And why did last week did they specifically mention that S.W.O.R.D doesn't make weapons? And then why, when you saw the video of her breaking in, can you tell that Vision's corpse has been chopped into pieces? Because remember, he died in one piece, but now he's all hacked up into bits, and there's a load of scientists mucking about with him. So, right, it's all of this is setting us up so that we know that The bad guy, the person who's been doing this in secret, is baddie GMan. Now, honestly, just go back and rewatch these scenes and you'll see this stuff. Now, like, most of these comments don't even emerge logically from the conversations they're having. And the final cherry on at the top of this was when Wanda's outside the Hex. She has that little bit where she says,
"And no one will ever take it from me again."
And she looks right at the G-Man when she says that, because she knows fine, she's a telepath. And sure, I might be wrong. I'll be really interested to see what happens over the next few weeks of the show. And I really hope that this show actually does outwit me, because there's nothing better than that. Nothing better than watching a show going, ugh, this is just going to be this happens. And then it shows like, nah, I'm much cleverer than that. That's great. And I really don't think that's going to be the case. But unfortunately, I really don't think that's going to be the case. But we'll have to wait and see. So till next time, this has been an extremely long, grumpy opinion on WandaVision. Bye-bye. And a special thanks to everybody listening, and especially my patrons, and most especially to Michelle Forbes and Judith Coloma, my top tier patrons. Thank you everybody. Everybody stay safe. Cheerio.